Alrighty, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to part 2 of the mini-series on labeling security and traceability. This is building off of part 1, where Rob started last week looking in CodeSoft. Today, we're going to be looking at more of an enterprise add-on component called Label Archive and the feature set there. To introduce myself a little bit, my name is Scott Fabian. I'm an enterprise sales and support engineer here at TechLinks, coming up on a little bit over 3.5 years working at TechLinks, coming up this Christmas. When I'm not labeling, you'll usually find me either at the beach or a park or at a gym somewhere playing volleyball with my friends. And another little fun fact is I'm actually not native to Wisconsin, where we are based here in Milwaukee. I'm still getting used to the winter after 7 years from coming from California. Before we actually get into the agenda here, take a look at a couple of housekeeping items. First, we have a live moderator for this chat. His name is Tony. That's the man behind the chat window there. If you have any questions on anything I'm talking about or anything that comes to mind, feel free to fire away in that chat. Tony will answer your question for you if it's a quick one, and if not, we'll circle back to the more in-depth ones after the demonstration. So now with the housekeeping out of the way, take a quick look at the agenda here. We're going to be looking at Label Archive and how can we accomplish all of these things within our labeling process. So creating an approval process with user permissions, using that in tandem with built-in label version control to make sure that we have the right version being printed all the time, and making sure that process is followed all the time automatically, and being able to look back into that process after it's complete or at a certain point in time to see who, what, where, when is all happening with our labels. So we mentioned Label Archive a couple times. What exactly is it? It is an enterprise add-on to CodeSoft that really supports everything we just talked about there. So it supports multi-stage approval steps. So when the label designer submits for approval, that's seen by some approval users and then finalized for print users at the end. We'll take a look at this more in depth in the demo. And with all that comes user control when it comes to permissions, record of everything that's happening, whether it's label changes, approvals, anything having to do with the label process is all going to be tracked there in Label Archive. It also supports CFR and GHS regulations when it comes to labeling in that space. So those features kind of we'll be digging into here, the design, approve, print idea. So it's going to be starting off wearing a hat of the design user. I'm going to create a label, submit that for approval, and then go through the hat of the approval user, what that looks like, and approving the label as part of Label Archive, and finally connecting as the print user so we can look at printing and afterward reviewing all of that print history and action we've been taking. And the idea here is being able to set things up and set it and forget it so that the process is always followed, so we can avoid unwanted changes and track and trace and see what has been happening in case we need to analyze our process or if there's any changes that need to be made. The version control with labels is nice as well. So as opposed to a standard setup where labels are held on a shared drive and there's some read-only access maybe for some users, changes happen pretty haphazardly. It's just replacing a file up there, and then the history of that is lost. With the version control, we can actually go back and see a history of our different versions of the labels in Label Archive, going in to see what changed between, say, version 3 or version 7. We can go back and compare those side by side to make sure the right labels are being printed all the time, and if we need to revert back to an older version, we can do that pretty easily. The governing body kind of behind everything here is that automated workflow. So looking at how do we set this up and what does it look like for our users? That's what we're going to be seeing in the live demo. So as we're going through it, I'll kind of mention the different components of it, but it's setting that up so that it's always being followed. There's not someone running around kind of administering the whole process of printing out the label, putting it on a piece of paper, finding the person to get a signature for approval of that label, run back, put that file up on the shared drive for everyone to access and print from. Everything is kind of managed by Label Archive. So once it's set up, it's just followed without anyone really needing to babysit it. And then after all this is kind of said and done, the process is in place, people are following that process, we can go back and take a look at a window of time of everything that happened for a particular label or for maybe for a print for a particular serial number or lot number or anything in history that's happened as part of labeling. So if there are any errors or misprints that happen, we can go back and see where that came from. Say, who printed it, who actually approved the label if it was an erroneous approval, and kind of have a track and trace behind so we can prevent errors from happening in the future. So anyway, what we have here, the poll, like I was mentioning, just kind of going over, hey, do you encounter any errors in your labeling? If so, how often is that? Is that daily, weekly, monthly? If you haven't thought about it, maybe something to just kind of review for yourself, and we'll kind of dig more into that in a little bit. Cool. So a couple more seconds here. Awesome. So looking like as far as results go, about monthly errors, sometimes weekly. So we'll kind of dig into, that's kind of a nice part of Label Archive, being able to look back and say, we had a mistake 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. Hard to remember, especially with business going so quickly on the day-to-day, so we can go back and see those errors at any point in time. Cool. So kind of going over, we just talked a lot about different features, what we can do in Label Archive. Going to dive into all that here with the approval process, looking at version control, how that automated workflow kind of takes us through the process, and finally taking a look at the history of everything there. So what I have prepared is just kind of a demo environment, a few disclaimers. It's a pretty simple environment. I'll explain it as I'm going through, and everybody's environment is a little bit different. There's different use cases we need to account for. So we'll go ahead and make sure that if you have any questions about that, we can answer those about how it pertains to you specifically. So I'll go ahead and share out my environment here. Alrighty. So what we're looking at right now is CodeSoft, which is what Rob started with last week. Label Archive, like I said, is a bolt-on component to CodeSoft. So throughout the demo here, we're going to be emulating a whole design process with different roles and different users. So we're going to be wearing a couple different hats throughout. So we'll start by connecting to Label Archive. That's kind of the root of everything, how all the user permissions are distributed, and how I can see what I need to see is by logging in here. And I'm going to connect as the design user so that I can come in and actually play my role as a designer. So once I connect, I see my message, established connection successfully. Fantastic. I'm ready to go. And I'm now connected to Label Archive with a few extra options here. So as my designer, I'll do my role here. My job is to create a label, a parts label. I'm going to make it very, very quickly, just pulling from an existing label. But this would be the whole design process, going through and creating these fields and the data sources that we're seeing here. So here is my label, and part of what we want to look at here too today is the potential process. So say I started this is how the point I got to. I need to make a few more changes, but I'm not quite done yet. It's the end of the day. Maybe I have to move on to another task. So to commit this label to Label Archive, I'm going to check in the label. So verbiage up here, as opposed to saving it or opening anything, Label Archive actions are checking in and checking out, or the equivalent there. We stole that from your local library. So I'll check in this label in a draft state. Draft meaning it's still a work in progress. And I'll name this my parts label. We see it's going in here as version 1. We can see that the design user, and the author of this document, so we can see who's creating it. And I'll leave a comments as well. We can force comments just to kind of know what's happening in between versions at a high level. So I can say created parts label. With stable variables. Something simple, something a little bit more indicative to what the design is actually for. So I'll hit OK here and commit those changes. And what's happening right now is the label itself that I've created here is being saved to the central database. So no more dealing with file directories or share permissions or anything like that. It's all managed through CodeSoft and Label Archive and the user permissions. So I can as a user now see whatever I'm supposed to see and not have to worry about working with files or directory locks or read-only or anything like that. It's all managed through those permissions. So if I come in here, I come back to the next day, let's say, I need to go finish my label. We can see that this parts label is in here as version 1. In the state, that little icon with the red ellipses means it's in a draft state. And so what does a draft state mean necessarily? There's 3 different states of labels in Label Archive. First is draft, which is what we're seeing here, this kind of work in progress. Second is the in approval state, which is the limbo between draft and final. In approval is just a label that's part of that automated workflow. And a final, which is production ready and printable. So we'll kind of take a look at each one of those in more detail. But right now, the draft, I'll check it out because I want to keep working on it and complete it. And maybe my last change here is just adding a logo up top. So we'll go ahead and do that. Excellent. I'll size it down. Perfect. So I think this looks pretty good. It's matched whatever I was assigned to create. So I'll go ahead and check this label in. Like I say, I added logo as my comment. We can see as opposed to a draft, which would be just incrementing to a version 2 and still in that working progress, that draft label, I can submit this for approval. And so by doing that, when I hit OK here, it's going to prompt me for a certain rule set that I want to run. So talking about those workflows, we can have actually more than one. I have a couple in here that are pretty straightforward. One is an administrator needs to approve, and the other is a manager needs to approve. But say for different labels, maybe for different customers or for different parts of the business, we need to have different groups of people approving those labels. So we can set up different approval rules for each of those processes, and we don't have to be chained to just one. So for the one I'm going to use here, I just want my administrator to approve it. So I'll hit OK, and off it goes. So what happens when it goes into the approval process? The first step is an email goes out to the users who are next in line. So we can have multiple users in line. Mine is very straightforward. There's just one. So the administrator user just got an email saying, hey, there's a label waiting for you in Label Archive. So I know now as the administrator that I need to go in and approve it. So I'll disconnect here as the design user. I'm done for the day. And we can move on to put on the administrator hat. So I'll sign in here as the administrator. We can see immediately here's this notification that says, hey, the parts label is seeking approval. So I'll open up the approval request. There's a few different aspects to this. We'll go over the critical stuff. The first one, of course, being the most important, which is the preview or how the label looks. So that's the whole idea that we're getting to here. So we can see the preview, and if we need to as well, we can run a test print to a printer that's attached to our station. We can take a look at the label, make sure it looks good. And, you know, to the point of actually doing a test print, to make sure that doesn't get confused with an actual production label or something that could actually go on product, there's a big test watermark that goes across the middle of it to make sure that no one actually mistakes it for a production label. So after we take a look at the label, maybe test print it, we can see some of the history as well if we want to. This is just a pretty brief history because the label is very new. We created it a few minutes ago. We can see that it was the design user who created it and started off the approval process. Getting to the approval tab, this is where the magic happens, so to speak, and this is where the approval will actually go through. Before I actually approve it, I'm going to take a look and show you guys the in approval kind of icon and what it looks like when it's actually in Label Archive. So if we go to the checkout screen, we can see we have 2 versions of this label, which is our draft, the first one that we were looking at, which is the one we initially created earlier, and this is our in approval with that red question mark. So looking at the labels themselves, here's that version control we were looking at. We could compare these 2 next to each other and see that there's a logo added with the comments here as well that kind of tells us that. But if there's any other details like a font change or anything, we can compare those 2 object by object. And if I'm a print user, let's say I'm not actually able to go in and check that label out. We'll take a look at that in a minute when we connect as the print user, but there's keeping us, the permissions and the user groups are keeping us from actually using these labels in production until this is finalized. So I'll jump back into the approval here. And I can leave a comment if I'd like to as the user who's approving. If I don't want to, I don't need to, I can just go ahead and approve. But you can notice that the deny button is grayed out here. And what that means is we need to give some feedback to our design user before we actually deny it so that they can know what to change. So maybe the logo is too small or something to that effect. We can now actually deny this. And what would happen in this case is the design user would get an email sent back to them saying the label was denied. Here are the comments along with that, so they can go in and rectify those changes and then resubmit for approval. I'm going to give myself a pat on the back though. I think that label looks good, so we can say it looks good and hit approve down here. If we want to wait to actually release the label to production for a different date or a different, for whatever reason, we can go ahead and set that to a future date so that we are approving, we're getting kind of the work done now for the label to be printed later. And the same goes for the expiration date, just vice versa. It's pulled out of production at a certain date. So I'll go ahead and approve here. This is a password prompt to fit the CFR requirement for electronic signatures and passwords at critical actions. So just in case, if someone leaves their computer open, no one can jump in and approve their own label just by opening up CodeSoft on the station. We need to enter the password again. So that looks good. Everything else here is kind of taken care of. And now we can see the label is approved. So at this point, what will happen is the design user will get a feedback again in the form of an email saying the label was approved. And then we can move on to the next step of the process, which is finally printing the label. So I'll disconnect as the administrator here and connect as my print user. And go in and check out a label so we can actually print it. You'll notice now that the red question mark is turned into a green check mark. Green check mark signifying that's a final label, as you might guess. And so that's something that we can go in and open up now as the print user. Say if I was, I misclicked and I try to open up this one, or I was trying to see maybe what's on this draft label, I try and check it out, I get a message that says you can't because that's not part of the permission set that's allowed for this user. So I'll go ahead and open up the final. And the idea, of course, behind a final draft is that no changes can be made unless it's a change that we want them to change, like maybe the part number example for this label. But as I'm clicking around here, there's nothing that I can do to modify fonts or bump fields a certain direction. There's no potential mistakes that I can make here. So kind of protecting and making the label secure from that perspective as well, and the idea behind our final label. So we can come in here. I'll print out a few labels. We'll print out our part number 11. We'll print maybe a 55 or a 66. And finally a 102 maybe. Cool. So those were, the parts that were, for example, on a pick ticket or a traveler tag or something that I was now responsible as the print user for printing. So now that I'm done with that, I can undo the checkout or close the label and then disconnect. So the print process there being protected in, kind of information, from beginning to end, label was created, it was then approved, and until that point, no one could touch it from a printing perspective unless we were test printing. And then finally, after the label is approved, the print user can then go in and open that label up. All that kind of just happening for us with the emails going out and users being able to interact with only the ways that they're supposed to. So we don't need to worry about running around for that approval signature, or if someone goes in and opens a label too early before it's actually approved and then prints it erroneously. All that's protected just with the step-by-step approval process. So finally, after all this is done, say we want to go in, there's someone asking for an audit report of a certain label or for a certain day of printing. All that, like I just mentioned, is within Label Archive just as part of the software it's built in. So I'll come in and connect again as our administrator user to run through some of that reporting. So we can see that that label is done. I'll go ahead and then, as opposed to checking in or checking out or anything, I'm going to go into our history part of Label Archive. So open it up, we can see our labels. I can come in and say, this is the label I want to see the history for, and come over to this tab. And similar to what we saw earlier, everything is kind of just detailed in here as to what was done and who done it over on the other side, and as well as when. So all these different things are happening here. Say, if we're printing for a whole week, or there's a lot of history to sort through, we can do some searching depending on what we're looking for. So for example, if we're looking for prints that included our part number 11, we can come up here to the variable search and say, I want to search by labels with the part number that were printed with the value of 11 in there. So with part number, I can search for 11 and apply that history, and we can see, hey, here was that print record. It was done by the print user. There was one label printed to the bullzip PDF printer. We can see all the other variable data elements on this job as well. So if there's a need to just kind of quickly glance at some history, we can go find it through the history tab. Say, for example, if someone's looking for kind of an audit report for, so just kind of keeping that kind of on hand in case we need to present it to somebody, we can actually create a report of all that history. So if we come into the versions of Label Archive here and use the same label, we'll be able to use a report and kind of come up with something to present to someone that's actually tangible. We can, however that report needs to look, change it and include the only necessary information that we need on there. So for our example, say we want the date and the time. We want to see who took that action, and we want to see the part number on there, as well as the lot number, for example, as all the different elements we want on the report, as well as a comment to see if there was a printer there or what happened in that step. So this is all just the pieces of information we want on this report, and everything here in the options is just how that report's going to look. So maybe we just want to report on version 2. We don't necessarily need to preview the label, show all of our different information, portrait, landscape, so on and so forth. So we can come back then after all that's done and generate this report. And now we can see all those different pieces in a nice table view. So this is all of our printing that was done today. If we want to include more just printing, we can just check all these boxes down here. We want to see all the different changes, approvals, so on and so forth. So now as we generate this report, we can see not only the print history, but also the other history in here where it was approved, who created it, and who actually did that printing. And with this report, then we can just take it into the form of a PDF or a Word doc or Excel and send it to whoever needs it. Cool, so I'll go ahead and switch back over to our presentation. So the demo itself, just to recap a little bit, we saw the different hats of the process in the approval where the designer submitted to the administrator and the administrator actually approved to make sure that the label changes were correct. The version control, we saw that the version 2 was our final, and with the permissions, our version 1 was not allowed to be checked out by our print users, and how the workflow just kind of saved time in general, and all that was being tracked on the back end to make sure we had a history of what was going on. We'll launch another poll here as far as everything that we just saw. If you have an idea of maybe what makes the most sense off the bat for your particular environment that you're looking at. So whether that's the approval process, whether that's the workflow, whether it's the track and trace, or a combination of any of them, whatever kind of you see as maybe the most benefit from looking at that just now. We'll give a few more minutes if anyone wants to cue the Jeopardy music, or a few more seconds, excuse me. couple more seconds here. We'll give the full 60, and I'll close it here. And kind of take a look at that. Looks like primarily the approval process making sense, and then the version control and track and trace coming in close behind, and that kind of all makes sense and is all built into Label Archive, and all would work well in tandem with each other, like we just saw. Cool. So a little question and answer. We'll take a look at the chat here to see if, as far as questions go. Question of how long is the history actually archived for? However long you actually need it. So we have options of clearing out the history automatically over after 3 months or 6 months or a year, or we can just leave it forever for as long as you're required to retain it or interested to retain it. How many labels can Label Archive actually keep track of? As many as we have storage for. You can keep all your labels in there. A few environments I have that I've implemented have a few thousand, and some only have between 10 and 20. So really, the limit is just the storage space we have. Question of this being recorded. Yeah, we'll have this recorded, and we can make that available to anyone who actually needs the recording for bringing back to the business or just to review for themselves. We can definitely do that. For question on GDPR standards and standards across the board, we can definitely meet all those with you, kind of working in collaboration to make sure the process fits exactly what you need for that standard, as well as the labels themselves to make sure they're fitting that spec as well. So short answer to a long answer to a short question is yes, we can meet GDPR standards. Cool. All right. So I'm guilty of myself. If anything, where I've left a meeting and I immediately think of a question afterwards. So if that happens, don't worry. You can definitely reach out to us with our customer support team, or head over our website, see if we can get that question answered for you. And thank you everyone for joining. After you close out, there's going to be a survey that pops up. It'd be awesome if you would fill that out for us. And yeah, I am horrible at goodbye. So thank you everyone for joining us. Yeah, have a great day.